So we have one presentation today, Masterson, Coy. Coy is originally from Maryville, Tennessee. He attended Maryville College, where he earned his BA in biology in 2009. He's currently the lead curator for the Appalachian Bear Rescue in Townsend, where he's worked for the past 4 years. And as part of a partnership between ABR, the University of Tennessee, TWRA, and the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, which we have some representatives here today. Coy has started graduate school at UT in 2014, and they're collecting some information on post-release data of bears that are released in the wild by ABR. And he's studying under Dr. Clark and Dr. Muller, and today he's going to be talking about his master's research.
Thank you, Dr. Gray, for the introduction. I want to thank everybody for coming out here today to show your support for this seminar series. It's obviously important for graduate students to learn. So as Dr. Gray said, my name is Coy Blair, and the title of my graduate research here at the university is Assessing the Survival, Movements, Space Use, Nuisance Behavior, and Denning Ecology of American black bears released back to the wild from the Appalachian Bear Rescue. I'd like to start off with just some background information regarding management, a few management considerations and the decisions that wildlife managers face when it comes to orphaned and or injured American black bears. As most of you would agree, and bear researcher John Beecham pointed out in his study published earlier this year, the welfare of individual bears and their populations are very important. At the same time, the public's opinion regarding the treatment of wildlife is important as well, and even more so today than ever in the social media linked world that we live in. And this is yet another aspect that wildlife managers must face when making these considerations. I put together a list of various options that wildlife managers face when they discover young, orphaned, and or injured American black bear cubs and the choices that they may have to deal with those. First, they can choose not to intervene. They can choose to euthanize the bears humanely. They can attempt to reunite all the bears with their biological mothers, foster them out to wild adoptive females, place them into permanent captivity, or attempt to rehabilitate them. The first choice, which is choosing not to intervene, although it may sound harsh, it is a biologically sound method that can be used, and research has shown that bears as young as 5.5 months of age can survive on their own in the wild. In fact, a study by Erickson in 1959 pointed out that bears at this same age not only survived the winters alone in Michigan, but did so with some pretty debilitating injuries, ranging from lacerated paw pads up into a fractured mandible. Nevertheless, the public is not very receptive of this method. They hate seeing these bears staying around their house for 24 to 48 hours while wildlife managers try to give the sow or the adult female, the mother, time to come back. Oftentimes she is nearby, she's hidden and concealed, and so they try to give the mother time to come back and not accidentally create an orphan. A second option is to euthanize the bears humanely. And there's no doubt that this is the absolute right option for bears that are suffering. And sometimes I've taken bears to the University of Tennessee before, the vet center, and I asked what the prognosis is, and if the bears are going to, if they're going to require a long duration of treatment, say 8 to 10 weeks, you really have to think about taking a wild animal, being in close proximity to the animal for that period of time. You could really run the risk of habituating it. So then its chance of going back to the wild is zero. But what about when managers are exposed to young neonate cubs such as this one pictured here? Say 2 to 3 weeks old, the eyes are just opening, can't get around on their own, they're altricial young. The public is not very receptive of euthanizing this animal. It's otherwise healthy. So what would you do in those situations? There are other alternatives. A third option would be trying to locate the biological mother. This is the best case scenario. If you know where the natal den is, which is a long shot, you can try to transport these cubs to that natal den and the sow can accept them. This has been done successfully in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, as you can see referenced here. However, this option is usually not feasible. Either you do not know the location of the natal den, or perhaps the sow is no longer available due to being hit by a vehicle and killed, known poaching events, other such circumstances. A fourth option would be to attempt fostering these bears to wild surrogate mothers. And I'll just point out that bears have a natural, or have been observed in nature, adopting foreign young on their own without any help from humans. And this has been noted in American black bears, brown bears, and even polar bears. But also, importantly, as humans have, or human-mediated fostering of bear cubs has been very successful as well. This has occurred from the late 70s through the 80s, 90s, and it's still in work today. And there are different methods to get this going, techniques, how the adult females will accept the non-kin, but basically you transport them to a den where you know the whereabouts of a surrogate female, place those non-kin, immobilize the female, place those non-kin in with that surrogate mother, and she can care and nurse for those young just as she would her own. The problem with using this option is that the timing is very critical. So you're going to be operating within the denning period, which puts you in a specific window of time. And as Alton Beecham pointed out in their 1984 study, trying to foster bears after the denning period resulted in only one success out of 11 attempts, whereby 2 of those failures actually resulted in the adult female using her paw to kill those non-kin. A fifth option would be to place these bears into permanent captivity. And right off the bat, openings just simply may not be available. This is often an issue with zoos and sanctuaries. There's just not a lot of room if you think about all the orphan wildlife that occur throughout the state and just the nation. The major drawback for this method, however, is taking a wild animal and placing it into permanent captivity, especially a bear that may live 18, 20 years. The last thing that wildlife managers are going to want to do is put a truly wild animal into a permanent situation such as that. And this is more reserved for and ideal for bears that are already habituated, such as the one pictured here. This bear actually came to ABR on that leash. It was never an ideal candidate for rehabilitation and release back to the wild. We were asked to house it temporarily until the responsible agency could find placement for it. This bear is now at the Knoxville Zoo. A sixth option is trying to locate a rehabilitation program to keep the bear. And the first major benefit to this method is what you see here in this picture. They get a second chance to be released back to the wild. This is obviously beneficial to wildlife managers. In fact, this method could help the bears in need, the wildlife official, and unlike some of the other options, it does have great public approval. As you can see from the screenshot of ABR's Facebook page, they have over 193,000 followers with a 4.9 out of 5-star review. A little background on Appalachian Bear Rescue, or ABR. ABR has, just this past year, 20 years experience in caring for wild and orphan bears. Since they received their permit to house bears in 1996, they've cared for a total of 257 up till today. And ABR has invested large sums of money into their program, such as funding this particular research, to ensure that they're doing all that they can to take care of these bears in the best way possible, but in addition, get them back to the wild and keeping them wild as possible. Oftentimes, ABR is consulted from other rehab facilities throughout the nation, sometimes the world, on their specific procedures. So how do you justify research regarding post-release information of bears released from Appalachian Bear Rescue? And what we have is that ABR has released over the years at least 200 bears back to the wild. However, the fates of those bears are mostly unknown. There was a study by Jay Clark that was published in 2002 in Ursus, and Jay actually used very high frequency, or VHF, radio tracking collars to follow 11 bears that were released from ABR. One of the bears was taken to the Cataloochee area of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and the other 10 were taken to the Tellico Bear Reserve in the South Cherokee National Forest. What Jay found was that 7 of these 11 bears dropped their collars. It's just hard to collar those young bears, and you have to err on the side of the collar being too big rather than it becoming ingrown. So Jay actually discovered, or Mr. Dr. Clark discovered that survival was relatively high at 0.77, but this was for the short term up to 180 days post-release. In general, as John Beecham pointed out in his study last year in the Journal of Wildlife Management regarding captive reared bears, the data, the literature is just very limited for yearlings, and even more so for cubs of the year. And by cubs of the year, I'm talking about bears that are less than 12 months of age. My specific research objectives for this study regarding Appalachian bear rescue bears released during 2015 and 2016 will be to determine the post-release survival of these bears, identify any variables that affects this survival, determine call-specific mortality, evaluate their movements and space use, evaluating potential nuisance behavior, and evaluating any denning preferences. My study area will include both the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and the Cherokee National Forest. Here's a map showing the north and south regions of the Cherokee National Forest, highlighted in green. These regions are further subdivided among 4 separate ranger districts. This map shows in green the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So when you add all that together, it gives me a total combined study area of everything you see here in pink. At ABR, bears are going to be housed in a wild enclosure setting. It's a real natural forested setting, and the bears will be cared for this study as they would any other time throughout the year, with as limited human contact as possible. And once the bears release a sufficient weight and are deemed healthy enough, they'll be ready for release. On the workup dates, all bears will be weighed and morphometric data will be gathered. And these release sites are going to be worked out between the agencies responsible for the bear. So there's a lot of planning that's going to go into place to discuss the date of release and the site of release. And that's going to include the current season, the current time of year, the hunting season, if there's natural food availability in the wild. But importantly, in order to gather this return data, all bears that are worked up during 2015 and 2016 are going to be outfitted with global positioning system or GPS tracking collars, as you can see here. The specific collars that we chose to use are manufactured by Vectronics Aerospace out of Berlin, Germany. And these collars rely on the Iridium satellite constellation, and they have been programmed to take a fix or a set of coordinates every 3 hours. Those locations will be relayed to me via the server and software. Every collar will have a drop-off timer set for about a year's time. We're trying to get at least a year's worth of data. However, in an emergency situation, if we needed to release any collar, we have a remote in which we could do that at any time. All the collars will also have mortality sensors. So basically, if the collar remains motionless for a 24-hour period, I will be notified with an alert via a text or email of those coordinates and what time and where the mortality occurred. They also include hibernation delay sensors. This is just the way that we could reserve battery life. And when the bears go into the denning period and decide to den and the movements go below a specified threshold that I set up front, the collar will conserve battery. Also, all collars will have a very high frequency or VHF beacon, and it will be turned on for a period of 24 hours. And this is not only to assist in the homing in on mortality locations or collar locations, but also should the GPS component fail, we'll have a backup. For data analyses, survival will be determined using known fate models and program MARC. And for this specific study, I will have to use a staggered entry design. Due to bears coming in and leaving at different times throughout the year, a staggered entry design will account for that. All the data will be entered into the models at weekly intervals. And all taught models will be based on those with the lowest AIC or Akiki's information criterion values. I will include individual covariates into the models, including release weight, release location, release season, number of care days, and maternal nuisance history to determine which, if any of these variables, have the potential to affect the cub's survival. Cause-specific mortality will simply be investigated in the field Whenever I receive those mortality alerts via text or email, I will travel to those last known coordinates, use a VHF receiver and antenna to home in on that location of the caller. If indeed there's a carcass or remains at that site, I will gather those, collect those, and transport those to the University of Tennessee's College of Veterinary Medicine for necropsy, for analyses. And if it appears just to be a collar drop, I'll go ahead and do a 10 meter diameter sweep of the area before I conclude that it was indeed a drop. For movement analyses, I plan on using a geographic information system, most likely ArcGIS and the R statistical software to evaluate the land cover utilization, compute a 95% kernel density estimate, 50% core use areas, compute a 95% minimum convex polygon home range estimate. And this is so that I can compare apples to apples. A lot of the earlier studies relied on the MCP or minimum convex polygon method. So that's why I chose this one in particular. Also, very importantly, I will calculate total net and mean daily movements in kilometers, and also calculate circuity of movements and any homing tendencies that the bears may have. And what the circuity of movements is going to tell us, you basically divide the net movements by the total movements. And that will, it's like a directional analysis. It will tell us if that bear, regarding the release site, tended to stay at that point or head directly away from it. Nuisance behavior, simply relying on state and federal agencies to report to me anytime the bears are found in a nuisance situation. For denning preferences, I will note den entrance and den emergence dates. And so the den entrance dates will be the last known active date prior to the denning season. And I can look at the data to figure this out. And the opposite holds true for the den emergence dates, the first known active dates post-denning. At every den site, I'll record what type of den it is. If it's a ground nest, a snag or a tree den, an excavated den. Also at the site, I'll record the aspect and elevation of that denning location. And if it is indeed a tree den, I'll note the species and the diameter at breast height or DBH and the vertical or distance to the entry hole. So in summary, regarding bears that are injured and orphaned, managers have 6 choices. They can choose not to intervene, euthanize them humanely, reunite them with their biological mothers, foster them out, place them into permanent captivity, or rehabilitate. And bear rehabilitation offers help to bears, managers, and is greatly supported by the public. But the problem is that the data is limited. So that's what we're trying to get to. And it is my hope that this research will tighten that knowledge gap. Here are my sources. Photo credits. And at this time, I would like to just acknowledge the partnerships between the Appalachian Bear Rescue, the University of Tennessee's Department of Forestry, Wildlife, Fisheries, the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, and the Great Smoky Mountains National Park Service. I would also like to thank my committee, Dr. Lisa Moeller, Dr. Joe Clark, who isn't here today, and Mr. Bill Stiver, who's in the back of the room. I also like to thank all the help I've had with the park in particular and helped me locate callers. Mr. Ron Williamson back there has been tremendous help. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions that you guys may have. Yes, sir.
Does anyone, I know Jessica has some callers out on these bears. Does anyone have callers on bears in the park right now that are just straight wild bears, your survival rates and things like that? Just to see if there's catching the seasonal effect.
So the question is, are there any collared bears or collared wild bears in order to compare this data to, or Jessica's data to? And Bill, as far as I know, we have started. Have you guys started doing that? You didn't. Okay, I know that it was.
So we're trying to get money next year.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So there is a plan in place. Yes, sir.
I know there's good literature out on this already, but you're just going to look into denning preference as it relates to other spatial factors such as distance to nearest town, elevation, etc. So
the question is, am I going to look at denning preferences as it relates to human settlement and things of that nature. I think I have to. I think I could use ArcGIS to definitely do that, and see, what I come up with. Any other questions, guys?
But what are you going to do if this tells you something you don't want to know?
I've been asked that question a million times. Before this program ever took off, working for ABR, I obviously I try to be as unbiased as possible. I'm a graduate student when I'm here. And I've been asked that by our supporters. I've been asked by people in the field, what if this tells you something you don't want to know? And what is science? What if the medical field thought of it in that way? Well, this drug could save lives, but if we test it and it fails, what if we don't want to know that? You just can't operate that way. You got to be as scientific and as possible have that approach, which is what we're trying to do. And if it is something that we don't want to know, just like any other business, the ABR organization can step back and say, okay, what can we do differently? How do we fix this?
How are you going to determine your release sites? Because that might have a big impact on subsequent survival and habitat use.
Right. So how would we determine release sites? And there's already basically a set list of predetermined release sites. I know that the park has to use, and the state on state forest lands. And unfortunately, the best release sites would be in the interior of, say, the park, interior of the Cherokee National Forest areas. It's getting to those sites, so we're just limited. The way we do it now is, if a bear, say, comes from Blount County, we're going to try to get. We know that most likely came from the national park, so we'll get that bear to release site as close to that area as possible, but within reason, something that we could drive to and still release the bear. So all bears do go back to the county of origin at least. Yep.
How will that selection affect your results?
So the question is, how will choosing those release sites affect the results of the study? And that's a great question.
Well,
I'm
you've
not
got
sure.
criteria that are going to influence that selection site, I suppose.
Right. Yeah. It's going to be food. So yeah.
Tease that data to see if it's influencing what the critter does once it's gone.
And that's exactly why I have to add a statistician to my committee.
Right.
Sorry, I couldn't directly answer that question.
That's why I asked it.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a good point. Great point.
Maybe to answer your question, policies. Bears being park boundary on the park, bears outside the park on the state. And so generally speaking, people would handle back to the closest place they can park. We work with the state to say basically any bear that belongs to your cotton, you feel pretty confident in the park. So we're accepting those bears back in the park instead of taking them all the way down to Road County or all the way to Johnson. Thought process of trying to get back as close as possible.
Well, what's going through my mind is are you reintroducing a bear into a pretty stout population where they may have habitat limitations based on the population that they're being introduced to? You see where I'm coming from?
Right. Yeah, that's a valid point.
A bunch of bears already there.
Right.
Will that influence what this one's doing?
Right. Yeah. The abundance there is definitely, definitely could influence, does this bear choose to stay put? Does it have high site fidelity? Does it choose just to totally leave? I can tell you from looking at some of the data, bears will be, say, after a week at this release site, just totally went miles away and then settled down. I can't tell you exactly why they did it. Maybe male versus female differences, but the population could definitely be a factor.
It has enough bears actually to put bears part of this bears
Correct.
bear sample.
Right. Yeah. And that's why I highlighted, Dr. Jay Clark's study. A similar study was done. The technology was a lot different back then with VHF radio collars, and his sample size was 11, and then 7 of those dropped their collars. So whereas we've already deployed 43 collars. So, yes, sir.
Kind of gets to that a little bit, but so catch me up to speed. I'm putting you on the spot as far as how many
said you've got 43 collars out right now. How many have you had dropped?
We've had,
Nuisance problems have you
well, honestly, that information, we're kind of waiting until the study's published to release that. Yeah, but I can say that we've had just a handful of drops. We've still got plenty of bears out there. As far as nuisance histories, I will elaborate briefly on that. So you saw that one of my potential individual covariates for the program mark was looking at maternal nuisance history. So what bear researcher John Beecham found in his study last year was that they couldn't relate the maternal nuisance history with bears with the cubs getting into trouble. I can say that out of every nuisance problem I've had so far, which is a tiny percentage of the callers that are out there, all the mothers were involved in nuisance situations. Yes, sir.
A question. I followed your introduction and thought it was really good. Kind of go through that bulletin list and
Yes, sir.
pull all those out as options and kind of weigh them pro and con, lead into your rehabilitation
Right.
research project. But what I was unclear about is it seemed like adopting the bears out to dens.
Fostering.
Fostering, yeah.
Yep.
The disadvantages you kind of pointed to, it not being, the timing was critical, but that it had been successful. And I was just wondering if there were other disadvantages or kind of why, maybe, I guess, Appalachian Bear Rescue does a lot of rehabilitation, maybe not as much of that, finding the actual bears. But if you had enough collared bears, what are some other negative things about that if you did know where they were then?
It's a great question. So the question is, I think, why, or is Appalachian Bear Rescue still doing fostering, or what are some further limitations of using that method? And as a matter of fact, this is something that's underway now. I suspect, Bill, here in the next month, we're going to have a meeting with the National Park Service, Great Smoky Mountains National Park Service, Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, to sit down and get this fostering program up and running again, because we do know that it can be successful. The last thing you want to do from an ABR standpoint is take in a cub. There's like the 2 to 3 week old one, the picture I showed you. There's a lot of time investment. You have to bottle feed those cubs. There are several procedures and policies in place that help distance yourself from caring for that animal. You turn them away from you. So it can be done. When you get a single cub in, it's extremely difficult, because research shows that single cubs tend to gravitate toward their caretaker. So another limitation of fostering would be that, what about yearlings? We can receive bears through our permit by TWRA up to 2 years of age. At that point, there's fostering wouldn't be I didn't mention that, but you're right, that would be another limitation. But the best case scenario would be to foster these young bears out, and that is absolutely something that we are getting back into. Long before I started with ABR in 1996, probably through 98 or so. In fact, I think the first 10 or so bears, at least the first 8, were fostered out. 2 wild surrogate females. So that's something that I'm really pushing to get us back into doing. And it's going to take a lot of collaboration, as you mentioned, knowing where those potential surrogate mothers are located. And I think the biggest problem with that, or the way I guess people were able to do it a long time ago, is because there was so much bear research going on out of the University of Tennessee. So someone most of the time knew where some females were located. So if you don't have a research project, then you have no idea. So what ABR has done is we're taking any collars that we get back from this study, collar drops or mortalities or what have you, we're sending them off to be refurbished. And in addition, we're purchasing new collars for that specific purpose. I've already transported a few collars to Bill and Ryan to put out on some females for the sole purpose of keeping tabs on them should 2017 bring those small cubs. So we're on it. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a certain age limit for fostering? Isn't the timing, then timing important to what the age of
Right. Yeah. I can tell you that all black bears. So if the surrogate female has cubs of her own, which that's when you want to foster them out, the ones that you have, the non-kin you're trying to foster, should be within about 2 weeks or so of the age of those, because all black bears are born late January, early February. Yep. Right. Now that has happened. Yearlings have been found in the den with cubs of the year for whatever reason they've came back.
I want to add to this question.
Okay.
You answered it well. You have to have research bears out there in order to foster other idea.
Yeah.
So to have just bears with collars on them really doesn't fit the mold, if you will, managing bears naturally in the national park. So we would want to have some kind of research associated project going on rather than just random bears. So that is the big one.
Yep.
One last question.
Yes, sir.
Has anybody ever hooked a big halibut for you?
I know a guy that hooked one, but he couldn't reel it in. I should have put that picture right here.
Give Coy a round of applause.
Thank you.